You don't, oh, you do want attendees to show up though, because, well, no, it's in person only.
I think this one was set up as in person only.
This one's in person only, so no actual residents are going to be attending virtually. So it's just going to be Walt and Don and Rob coming in virtually, who should have the actual meeting thing, so they shouldn't need it to be broadcast, but I'll leave that up to you, Craig.
That's fine. Yeah, I think, well, let's leave it open for now, unless, so if something changes, we can adjust.
Hey, Steve.
I just turned you off so you weren't blasting out in the hallway.
Oh, sure.
Well, let me rephrase that. I asked Andrew to show me how to turn you on.
Okay.
All
All right, Craig, no offense, but I think I'm going to leave your meeting.
You're great. I appreciate it. Thank you again.
All right. See ya.
Bye. Okay, so we're in, so my login didn't change any settings. So we're in good shape. We only need that for who's here for tonight.
So Chris is talking about going down to visit his daughter in South Carolina. When she'd come back, you'd have to be quarantined. He was talking about how can you do it and can you work from home, and just like I'm going to take some plans to Kevin tonight. I said I can bring you stuff, whatever.
And I live across the street from him. So.
I said your other option is we can set you up in the dungeon, one of those old rooms.
Yeah.
I told him I'll even bring you a stapler. So he said, he goes, I know I'll get picked out a lot. He goes, but I kind of like that option. He said he thinks he's more productive being here. I told him, you've got to be clear. You can't come up and interact, but if you need something, you call off.
Yeah.
We'll open the hallway, we'll set it in the hallway, close it, you open your door, grab it.
Right.
But he has to stay isolated, I said, is the rules. So
Good.
it doesn't necessarily have to be at home.
I happen to know where a red stapler is, so I can make it just comfortable.
Now, one of those offices was, I think, Marlene's at one time. And that's what caused a lot of the friction with her. Bill Mulligan put her down there.
Gotcha.
When, again, they couldn't fire her for whatever stupid reason. Bill Mulligan thought it was a smart idea to put her down in one of those.
Well, that's exactly what they did in the movie Office Space. Is they just kept making his life shit, hoping he'd quit.
Yeah. Yeah, and all it did was piss her off.
Right.
Thanks. Good job.
Are you guys?
Well, Mulligan was never the sharpest tool in the shed. So
Not. Nope. Oh, Mr. Barley, good morning or afternoon, sir. He's on early. Okay, so 4 o'clock?
yeah, I'll be back.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Andrew, thank you.
No
Just
problem.
wanted to make sure that you were around so we could get this going. It wasn't any last minute, hey, what are you doing?
Call me if you need me.
Okay, no, we should be in good shape as long as everybody's here. That's going to be here. If we get, even if we get more logged on, we should be fine. All the other microphones work, so we'll be good. That's great. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, sir. How are you? Mr. Barley, are you there, sir?
are available for other parts of the town as well. The important thing, if you notice in the second paragraph at the end, the highlighted sentence, the last sentence in the paragraph, directing development to buildable properties or portions thereof. That's important to note that the real value from incentive zoning, when we're talking about the preservation of open space or farmland, is that it has to be buildable in order to be set aside, so that you're really gaining the preservation of land that might otherwise be developed. Otherwise, a developer might want to set aside wetlands, which are fine to set aside, but you're really not gaining the value from setting aside from development, because typically a developer cannot build on those wetlands anyway. So you'll see things like buildable acreage in the definition section, and that really means that a developer is being asked to set aside those properties that are buildable, but will be preserved permanently from development. The authority, this is just a reference to the two state laws, one being Town Law 261B on incentive zoning, and the other one being on the subdivision law, which is section 277. Legislative intent, we've been working as a group in putting the legislative intent in here. That's a little bit different from the purpose of incentive zoning. The town board is the major player in this process, because it will be the town board that either approves, denies, or places conditions on incentives. And in order for the town board to do a complete and justifiable decision on the incentive zoning, you have to look at what the legislative intent is. And Don's been a big portion of putting this in here. So the legislative intent basically establishes the fact that there are certain things of benefit to the entire community that are important for public health, safety, and welfare. So when the town board is looking at an application for incentive zoning, one of the things the board members will need to do is to look at this legislative intent and determine if the application in fact is meeting this legislative intent. And that's the thing like a finding that.
So this comes from discussions that we've had as a town board when we're ruling on stuff that was put in place years ago, and we ask the question, why did they put this in? This is the answer to those future boards who want to ask the same question. And it gives them guidelines by which they follow when they're determining whether it's improvement. Because if they come along and say, well, you know what, they're not really preserving the farm in this thing, so is that really what they were, you know, again, just using that as an example, or is that reused building truly long dormant, or was it just recently sold and dormant for 2 weeks, right? That, you know, so it just gives you something to go by when you're making future rulings to understand why we put this in place.
Yeah, it's legal. It's really a legal tool. I don't mean to speak for Don, but it is a legal tool that you can justify your action if the town board is challenged on any of their decisions. So just real quick. We'll go through some of the legislative intent. Preserving open space and the agricultural heritage of the town. These were two of the biggest issues really when we were doing the update to the comprehensive plan. And as it said here, this goes back to like 2003 when the town had done some of their original community surveys and asked people what's important to them in the town. Those surveys always come back with preserving open space and the rural character of the town, as well as agriculture. So again, these are two of the most important issues going back, 20 years that have been cited in the town. And especially, again, that's why one of the reasons we're focusing in on the rural residential zoning district that is south of the Thruway. Another legislative intent is to expand parkland, which provides more recreational opportunities for the residents. And oftentimes there's a real benefit if a developer comes along and in exchange for maybe more building lots, he expands existing parkland or he maybe creates some additional parkland. This would save those cost savings to the town at the expense of the developer. And again, that's a community benefit. Steve had mentioned the reusing of long dormant and vacant buildings. Last year, when we had done the mixed use overlay districts, this was one of the things that really drove the development of those overlay districts, was the reuse and redevelopment of vacant buildings and structures. But there are some areas, some buildings and some structures in the town that have long been dormant that aren't covered by the boundaries of the overlay districts. So this again is a situation where in exchange for an incentive, a developer actually can reuse a long dormant or a vacant building, bring them back on the tax rolls.
And when people say, why do you give incentives for that? Because a lot of times it's cheaper to build a new building than to revitalize an existing building. So if our, you know, and of course, what happens anytime someone builds a new building, one of the first things you hear is, great, there goes more open space.
Yeah.
So, you know, obviously if we can help tip that equation so that it makes more sense for them to reuse an existing building, and especially one that's, again, long dormant or vacant, I think everybody agrees that that's a benefit to the town.
Yeah. Any questions so far? Okay. Number 4, encouraging development projects to extend their sidewalks, cycling amenities, and pedestrian trails. Again, this is directed at a development that's occurring, but it's extending some of those amenities to the community beyond the development itself. So it may be connecting sidewalks to another existing sidewalk network somewhere, or those pedestrian trails, so that eventually the town can have a complete network of these connecting trails and sidewalks. In some cases, it might be doing something like setting aside a bike trail or bike lanes. And again, one of the things that we're looking at is consistency with things like the active transportation plan that we talked about last year. Bringing public utilities to older neighborhoods that are underserved by those utilities. This is what Steve was referring to earlier, is, you know, maybe there are older homes or sections of neighborhoods that are underserved by certain types of utilities, whether it's public water, public sewer, it may be access to high-speed internet, certain things that really could help upgrade the quality of life in those neighborhoods. So that would be provided by a developer, again, in exchange for him receiving some type of an incentive for his development, his or her development. Similarly, we have something in here about, you know, as development increases, there might become a situation where there needs to be less and less reliance on things like individual septic systems. So it's important that the town provide a means whereby homes can tap into not only public water, but public sanitary sewer. And then number 7 here is just realizing that there's long-term benefits from implementing incentive zoning through conservation easements. And in a few minutes, I'll go through the different types of conservation easements that we're identifying. But basically, these long-term benefits are, you know, preserving lands in perpetuity, hopefully, from development. There might be income tax or estate tax benefits for landowners through the existing tax laws. And this is something that Rob probably knows a lot more than I do. But there are things on the book where landowners and property owners can receive tax benefits for setting aside lands. And again, this idea that the community can gain certain benefits and amenities in an inexpensive way when it's really paid for by a development. I won't go through all of the definitions here, but some of the more important definitions are buildable acreage. When we're talking about the buildable acreage, again, this goes back to the idea that we're not asking a developer to set aside land that he couldn't build on anyways. We're asking him to set aside land that is buildable. That's how a community really gains value from this process. Cluster subdivision, this is really on the books right now, and it's something that is available to the town through town law section 278. We've gone through this, and it's important. We're making a distinction in this regulation that there's a difference between a cluster subdivision and what we're going to be calling a conservation subdivision. The cluster subdivision is really meant to be density neutral. So under a cluster subdivision, a developer would still set aside certain lands, protect them from development, but he would not be getting a density bonus in exchange for that. That density bonus would be gained through a conservation subdivision. Community benefits and amenities. Again, these are just a listing of some of the types that we've been talking about: preservation of open space, farmland, historic resources, development of housing for seniors of low or moderate income, creation of parks and recreation facilities, including trails, improvements to public infrastructure, might be extensions. And then under state law, the town does have the ability to require cash in lieu of actual physical improvements. If for whatever reason a physical improvement wasn't possible. The town can accept cash and put it into a dedicated fund that can only be used for those public improvements.
Yeah, one of the things that, again, this board has talked about in the past is we didn't want to get put in here where it could just be cash that goes into the general fund. We only wanted cash in lieu of those improvements, meaning that cash, so the classic example is East River Road. Now that's more seeker mitigation, but this concept is the same, that the overall project is too big for one project to bear. So you create a fund that all the projects kick into it and then use those funds to do the larger project. So it's the idea along those lines. Sometimes it might just be because, okay, they're gonna, and I'll use East River Road again, this for a different thing, right? We've been talking about doing the East River Road sidewalk, but it made absolutely no sense to do the sidewalk now or at that time when they were going to be installing a new water main right where our path was going to go. So if we'd have put in the sidewalk 2 years ago, it'd be ripped up by now. So that would be an example where the developer could put cash towards that sidewalk, but then that money could only be used to build a sidewalk. This board talked about or this board or the previous board, not wanting to have cash incentives because we see where some towns abuse that. It sort of becomes an additional fee to develop, and we didn't want to see it get to there. To us, that wasn't the same idea as doing these specific benefits. Does that make sense?
Yes, we didn't want any conflicts of interest being thought about.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
The one thing, as we're going along, the one thing I forgot to say is that this is a working draft, so that none of this is cast in concrete at this point. We just brought it to this point where we felt comfortable with it, which is why we're presenting it to the town board, but don't feel like this is a done deal. This is all still a working draft and changes can be made to the process.
Right. So again, I tried to bring all the stuff in that we've talked about in the past on the board, but obviously if I missed something or I got something wrong or, my own personal preferences exceeded the board's preference, change it. Like I said, it's my best stab at what we've talked about in the past.
I'll go through some of this a little more quickly, but again, on the definitions on page 4, we've got 4 different types of conservation easements that we've identified that the town is familiar with. The natural area, the environmentally sensitive areas like wetlands and floodplains, wildlife habitats, slopes greater than 15%. We have a maintained undeveloped open space that is basically open space that is set aside. It could be public or private.
Think green belts.
Could be green belts, could be areas that you know, are set aside because they're important habitats. So basically these areas would be maintained in some way, but without any type of permanent development or structures. Parkland, which is obviously, you know, publicly owned lands, there could be some type of non-permanent types of structures depending on their location. Again, you know, sometimes you know, communities will put their parklands in things like floodplains, you know, so that under flooding conditions, you want to keep structures out of there, but you could have movable or flexible structures in there. And then the agricultural conservation easements, which are, you know, the farmlands that are set aside for conservation or for agricultural purposes. Conservation subdivision, this is the one that I was talking about earlier that differs from cluster subdivision. Your open space incentive option that's on the books right now really does talk about a conservation subdivision, and some of the language is in there. The conservation subdivision, again, differs from the cluster subdivision. Under a conservation subdivision, you are setting aside buildable land, and in exchange for that, a developer is getting a density bonus or some other type of bonus where he may be provided more lots, but on smaller parcels, so that the density might increase a little bit, but still he's conserving a large part of the buildable property in perpetuity. As you'll see a little bit later, there's an open space requirement for conservation subdivisions, as well as cluster subdivisions. We'll get into that a little bit more. Incentives or bonuses, this is, you know, we identify each of these a little bit later depending on their location, but we're talking about things like increased density, maybe the changes in area, you know, lot size, maybe building height, you know, set aside of open space, maybe changes in use or other provisions of the zoning ordinance. Incentive zoning, we went through that a little bit earlier. Incentive zone, under state law, incentive zoning has to identify where different types of incentives are being offered. And so you'll see in a few minutes that we've identified different types of incentive zones based upon zoning districts. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then the last definition we have here is preserved open space. We're again making a distinction here between open space that may be available to the community, but it's not restricted in any way. It could be developed at some point in the future, as opposed to preserved open space where there is a conservation easement on the land that prevents it from being developed in the future. So it's in perpetuity for future generations. Next section talks about community benefits and amenities and what some of those are. These are not what a developer would be getting. This is what a developer would offer to the community in exchange for an incentive. So he might offer to the community the preservation of and conservation of undeveloped open space or environmentally sensitive resources. Things like scenic landscapes, agricultural lands, prime farmland. Might also offer creation or improvements to your parks, to civic space, to trails, to recreation facilities. Could offer some type of preservation of historic or cultural resources. Could be stabilization of a historic building that maybe is deteriorating. That would be one amenity that a developer could offer to the community to stabilize the building so it's not lost. Senior housing for persons of low or moderate income. This is another benefit that could be offered to the community. Water, sewer, stormwater, high-speed internet, other types of public utility improvements, bringing those improvements to a neighborhood. Public roadway infrastructure improvements, things like, you know, if you have a safety issue, including new sidewalks, or crosswalks or pedestrian or bicycling facilities, or maybe just streetscaping with new street trees and lighting facilities. Green infrastructure, meaning that, you know, green infrastructure could be things like community rain gardens or landscaped areas that might temporarily flood but control, you know, drainage issues. So, you know, more and more communities are relying on green infrastructure for their stormwater management. A developer might offer landscaping or some other type of community aesthetics, such as visual screening or sound barriers, if those issues exist in the neighborhood. And then again, any type of those types of amenities or benefits, or some other types of amenities or benefits that the town board might be asked to consider, in addition to what we talked about, the cash in lieu payments. It's important to note that when a developer or a landowner is offering these benefits or an amenity in exchange for a development project, these are benefits and amenities that go beyond what that development project might require by the zoning ordinance or through site plan or a special use permit or your subdivision regulations. So, you know, if a project is required, for example, to provide sidewalks, then the developer can't offer those sidewalks as a community benefit because it's already required as part of his project approval. But maybe he could offer to extend those sidewalks into another area or to connect the sidewalks to trails in other areas. So there's a distinction there, so that the community benefits and amenities go well beyond what a project would otherwise be required to provide for approval.
Another example would be if under seeker, they're required to add a traffic control device at their entrance or at an intersection nearby their entrance. That wouldn't count as a community benefit. That's a seeker mitigation.
Right. And then I just want to highlight number 5, that again, you've got the open space incentive option on the books already, and this section isn't replacing it. It's actually supplementing and complementing your open space incentive option. Now we get into the creation of incentive zones. Remember I said that under state law, you're required under incentive zoning to identify those areas where incentive zoning applies. So we've really identified 4 incentive zones and 4 types of incentive zoning. The first one is, well, let me back up for a minute. All of these incentives would be approved by the town board through a special use permit, and you would follow those special use permit techniques as part of this process, okay? The rural residential incentive zone, again, this is the big zoning district in the southern part of the town, south of the Thruway. This is where, you know, most of your agriculture still remains, and you have a lot of, you know, more of the recent subdivision development. So the rural residential incentive zone follows the exact same boundaries as the rural residential zoning district. And we'll be putting together a map. We won't be adjusting the official zoning map of the town, but we'll be putting together a separate map that will identify all of these different incentive zones, okay? We have here a list. Oops, so go ahead.
Hi, sorry. Well, amazing enough, a lot of stuff that we're going through, we have had projects that have come through and used some of the incentives that we're talking about today, and it's very good to see.
Yeah, yeah. The under the rural residential incentive zone, we have the list of preferred community benefits and amenities. Now, these are preferred. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be other ones that could be negotiated, but the preferred ones include the permanent preservation of open space, again, through a conservation easement, permanent preservation of environmentally sensitive resources, preservation of agricultural lands, maintenance, enhancement, and protection of historic and cultural resources, senior housing for low and moderate income folks, and then the creation of public parkland trails and recreational facilities. So again, these are the different types of benefits that the town would request from a developer in exchange for giving him some type of an incentive. Then number two, here, that lists the incentives or the bonuses that would be provided to a developer. The big one right here is a density bonus for an increase of single family housing in exchange for the preservation of open space. And this is through that conservation subdivision under your open space incentive option. And you would follow all of those procedures that are already laid out under the open space incentive option and the rural development design guidelines that have already been put on the books by the town. There's also a density bonus for an increase of multifamily housing units, but again, this is specific to senior housing for persons of low and moderate income. And this is all within the rural residential zoning district, okay, not other districts. There could also be some type of what we're calling complementary low impact rural neighborhood uses. So because we're in some of those rural areas, the town, may want to consider things like maybe a small grocery or a convenience store at some of the crossroads, or maybe a dine-in family style restaurant, or an agricultural supply or hardware store that might have, help local farmers, or a farm stand or a farmer's market. This is, there may be other things that can be added to this list at some point in the future. But these are some of the things that we thought might help with, some of the quality of life issues in the rural areas. Types of residential subdivision incentives allowed within the rural residential incentive zone. So there's really three types. One is your conventional subdivision, which is occurring now. That's under your conventional, your existing subdivision regulations and your site plan review process. And I would say probably most of what's been developed now has been developed as conventional subdivisions, which you're most familiar with in other areas. The other two types that go back to this cluster subdivision incentive. And again, I've highlighted a section here where they're meant to be density neutral. So say, for example, the existing zoning ordinance says, okay, if you develop this parcel, you can have 50 homes. Under a cluster subdivision, you wouldn't really be offering a density bonus to the developer. He would still be required to do the same density as a conventional subdivision without adding more lots, okay? And we have a requirement in the cluster subdivision for a minimum open space requirement of 30% if the project is within a rural residential incentive zone. The thing about a cluster subdivision though, it could be applied to other zoning districts in the community. Now, most of your other zoning districts are already fairly well developed and the neighborhoods are well established, but there could still be some parcels in some of your other residential areas that could be developed in the future for maybe small subdivisions. And instead of a conventional subdivision, a developer could put in a cluster subdivision. And again, you could still have some of those benefits of a cluster subdivision in some of those more established areas where you'd have open space set aside. So there is a benefit there.
One of the things I'll note, it's at the very last sentence of this thing. If you look at the existing open space incentive option, there was a column for a lower level of open space that is so easy to obtain with just a standard cluster that to me it made no sense to offer an incentive for it. In other words, you were hard pressed to not, I think it was like 35% open space. You were hard pressed to not have 35% open space. So I'm proposing we remove that column from the incentive plan because again, why give incentive for something that you almost have to do by definition? It just didn't make sense.
Yeah. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay. Okay, conservation subdivision incentive, again, this is the one that we're really trying to encourage in the rural residential area.
Oh,
This would,
that's the one I just talked about.
Yeah.
I thought you had already hit it, sorry.
no, that's okay. So a conservation subdivision would include a minimum open space requirement of 50%. And again, that density bonus, it's all laid out in the existing regulations. We're just modifying some of the language of those regulations, but the whole process has already been laid out, including the rural development design guidelines and how you go through that whole process. So we're just tagging on and making things consistent with the existing regulations. Now, in terms of the open space requirements, here at the bottom of page 8, all designated open space would be required to be set aside by a permanent conservation easement that runs with the land. So it wouldn't change when property owners change hands. It would run in perpetuity with the land. That land would be set aside permanently as open space. The open
Just to point
space,
out,
oh, go
We
ahead.
also talked about or designated as parkland, because again, either way, it's got a protection because you'd have to go through parkland alienation. So
Right.
we talk about that elsewhere. That's in that definition of preserved open space.
Yep. And then I won't go through each of these. You folks can look at them, when you have a chance to review this, and we can, if you have questions at that time, you can certainly ask us, send me an email, or, we can follow up with you. The other one that I really wanted to highlight here is, again, going back to this idea that the designated open space in either a cluster or a conservation subdivision must be considered buildable acreage. Okay? So that's not constrained by, slope or wetlands, those types of things. And then there's other references here to requiring buffer zones based upon minimal transitional buffers. We established all of those last year with the work.
Bob, did you have something?
No, I do not.
Okay, I thought I heard somebody start to speak.
I think it was one of my dogs.
Oh,
Okay, additional standards and criteria for approval. So again, this would be a list of things, and Mike and Rob are more familiar with this, but these are similar to the criteria we established for things like the special permit criteria last year that was adopted. These are additional things that the town board members would look at before deciding on whether you would want to approve or deny or put conditions on an incentive zoning application. So, the one thing, again, is it would have to be accomplished by the execution of a conservation easement. And one of the things that we're highlighting here is that it would have to be held by both the town of Henrietta and by an authorized conservation organization. So that might be someone like the Genesee Land Trust or the Henrietta Foundation, or maybe, some
Makes
other
sense.
foundations in the future.
and again, based on previous conversations with this board, we wanted it to be 2 organizations. So it's less likely that there's a spurious decision to allow something and you're like, why the hell would they do that? Right?
Yeah.
It's added protection to keep it conserved.
Yeah. Both the conservation parcels and the parcels being developed have to be located, within the rural residential incentive zone. We talk here about, the open space process, which I won't get into anymore right now. All of this will have to go through the seeker process. I'm looking at on page 10 at the top under E. All of these projects would have to go through seeker, and the town board will need to look at that, the seeker process and the decisions, and make sure that whatever incentive is being asked for, you'll need to make sure that it does not create a significant adverse impact on the environment, as well as on the community in general and the properties in the vicinity of the proposed project. So we're looking at different levels of impacts, not only on the natural environment, but on the community and the neighborhood. And those types of impacts down below, the highlighted ones in F, could be things like adverse changes in neighborhood character. You know, one of the things, if you're allowing a conservation subdivision to come in, and the houses are coming in on smaller lots, some people may say, well, that just looks too dense for a rural area. Doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't still approve the project, but maybe there are some ways to screen that project from the road or from other neighborhoods so that that density wouldn't be apparent to surrounding areas. Okay.
Yep.
Another thing is the preservation of rural sightlines along the roadways. So again, under the seeker process, as the planning board and the town board are reviewing these projects, one of the things you might want to do is to make sure that vegetation is kept in place along those rural highways, or views of historic barns or historic farmsteads are preserved so that some of that rural character is maintained. And then a final point on the assessments, you know, the land where you'd have a conservation easement, that would have to be assessed for real property purposes, with the knowledge that the restriction of the land is in place through that easement, so that there would be some tax advantages there. Okay, so that's the first of the four. These next ones will go much quicker. That first one that talks about the rural residential incentive zone south of the Thruway, that's really been one of our primary focuses because of the farmland protection plan and what we went through last 2 years. B, the commercial revitalization incentive zone. This one would follow along the boundaries of your commercial B1 and B2 zoning districts, okay? And the real purpose here is, again, to encourage reuse and redevelopment of buildings that are, or properties that are already developed, and trying to encourage development on those properties rather going to new properties and developing, you know, in green areas.
Mhm.
So again, we list a number of the benefits and amenities, many of which you've seen before. The one thing we talked about here was because some of these properties could support development, they might already be within the mixed use overlay district. So another means of encouraging their redevelopment might be adjusting some of those requirements of the overlay district, maybe reducing some of those requirements again to encourage a developer to reuse existing property rather than going to new property, new development. And then you'll see, you know, again, the different types, things like reduced setbacks, additional signage. Those are things that the planning board would have to deal with. Increased density and possibility of parking reduction bonuses, but that would have to be proved that whatever the use is would still have sufficient parking so that you wouldn't adversely impact the neighborhood.
So one of the things we talked about in the past as a board is that we're not necessarily experts on some of that stuff. So we kind of took this modeling from the way we do the Article 10 votes, where the planning board would make a advisory recommendation to us. We don't have to follow it, but it gives us their, for lack of a better way to put it, professional input on, you know, what their thoughts are on the impact of allowing some of those changes based off of, you know, things that are normally under the planning board purview. It keeps the approval of the incentives under us, but gets the recommendation from the planning board, since again, a lot of that stuff is things that the planning board understands better than the town board.
Okay, next is the neighborhood upgrade incentive zone. This is the third of those zones, and this would apply to new development, reuse and redevelopment in all of your zoning districts. And the idea here is, again, you'd be asking a developer to improve or extend things like utilities to serve those adjacent neighborhoods, maybe just because they're underserved, or maybe there are capacity problems with sewer, water, or something. So again, it would be trying to improve some of the adjacent areas where development is occurring. And then the list of preferred amenities and benefits, again, a lot of these you've seen before. This is what we're calling the drag along infrastructure. And then the similar types of incentives and bonuses. The fourth one is a historic properties incentive zone. This one too would apply town-wide to all zoning districts, wherever there might be some type of a cultural resource, whether it be historic or archaeological. And the whole purpose behind this is to encourage the preservation of those resources. And in doing so, maybe by a developer or by the neighborhood or by, someone else's encouragement, some of these potential resources could be put into eventually into some type of like a historic district. And this would apply to areas including the hamlets of East Henrietta and West Henrietta, where you want to preserve some of that historic character of those hamlets. And then we talked here about, this is the last paragraph on page 12, about the potential incentives to the owners, specifically things like reducing some of the existing regulation requirements for things like conversion of a barn into other uses. And we're also maybe providing that there be some type of tax exemptions. Again, this would all be subject to approval by the town and your taxing jurisdictions, and what is, consistent with state law and section 483B historic barns. So again, the whole idea is to encourage preservation and maybe reuse of historic resources, but then you're not discouraging people from doing that by taxing those improvements.
And again, some of this is what we talked about previously, trying to avoid essentially, I forgot the term, but basically through neglect that you allow the property to be demolished, or essentially lose its historic value because it's neglected to the point where it's no longer safe and has to go away.
Okay, now, so page 13, we're getting there. Procedure for the request of incentives. So basically, this just lays out how a developer would go through the process of requesting an incentive. And the first step really would be to go to, Chris Martin. And then he would follow the process like you do now for the other types of project applications. And then what follows here, what follows here are just some of the requirements that a developer would have to provide to the town. And this could be done simultaneously with other project applications like site plan applications. Just talks about, number 2, the authorization for the use of incentive zoning is subject to the approval by the town board prior to preliminary plat or preliminary site plan approval by the planning board. So again, this kind of lays out the process so that we make sure that a developer is being treated, fairly, so that he knows whether his project can move forward or not with an incentive in place.
Well, I just noticed in that list for the procedure, the things that have to be submitted,
Yeah,
nowhere on there does it say they have to submit a site plan with the application. Because it has the 2 special cases for the residential subdivisions, but there's nothing, if it's not a residential subdivision, it should include a site plan.
oh, okay. Oh, okay, all right, I'll add that. Okay. Good. Process would have to go through seeker, just like any other projects. And then this number 4 talks about prior to granting the approval again, you know, you'd have to go through at least one public hearing, and the planning board would have to refer the project proposal to the town board. Basically, the planning proposal has to indicate to the town board whether or not it meets all the requirements of the incentive zone. Okay. And what a lot of this talks about is actually putting some of the burden on the developer to make sure that the developer is making an argument that everything he's proposing in terms of the incentive he's requesting and the benefits he's proposing are consistent with the purpose and the legislative intent that we talked about at the very beginning, and consistent with things like the comprehensive plan, your farmland plan, your active transportation plan. So there are a lot of things that the town board members can look at and either approve or deny that will lessen your chances of being, you know, challenged on this. So it really does provide you, I think, some safety net. And then, you know, very finally, it's you can impose your conditions on the approval just like you would through any special use permit process. And then the final 2 sections on page 15, the standards for approval. Again, these are just additional standards like we've done for special permit applications. These just address the different types of things that the town board can look at and check off and make sure that, yes, your project meets this, or no, your project doesn't meet this. And, you know, we're going to place conditions on it or deny it or approve it. So this is, you know, all the different types of things that the board members will be needing to look at. If there's anything here specific that you see that you want explained, we can explain it, but I know we're kind of under a deadline here, so we're just about at 5 o'clock. And then the very last section is the cash payment in lieu. And that's what we talked about earlier. This is provided for under state law. And then we're very specific about if that is the way that a project unfolds, then any monies that would be provided by a developer would be kept in a dedicated fund, specifically.
Trust fund is the right term.
What's that?
Trust fund, I don't think is the right term. I'll get that from Linda.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Is there a certain amount of time that we can hang on to that money to use it towards a future project?
I'm not, I don't know. I don't think there's anything in the state law that may be something that, you know, we want to think about, but I don't think I've come across anything under state law that says that there's a timeline for using that.
What I think, Lisa, is if it's been sitting around too long, either an auditor or the state comptroller might say, you know, recommend. I don't know that there's a hard number,
Okay.
Yeah,
but they do get uncomfortable if it's been sitting too long. You know, we've got that right now in the one in the Henrietta Transportation Development District, where there's money that's been sitting there for a long time. And it's one of those, you're supposed to at some point either use it or give it back. The problem is you're supposed to give it back in ratio to how it was given and things like that. The companies that supplied it, most of them are, half of them at least are no longer there. So it becomes impossible to give back. So, you know, one of those things in terms of, as you look at that, you know, again, it should get used. But it's got to be used for whatever that designated purpose is, whatever the designation of the fund. So again, going back to that Jefferson Road Transportation District, it has to be used within that district for transportation related expenses.
Okay,
Fortunately, that includes sidewalks, cycling, so that's what we're going to use it for. But, you know, so in something like this, if it was in lieu of building a sidewalk, and maybe the sidewalk that they were intending to build just isn't feasible because we can never get the easements for it, then it could be used to build another sidewalk.
Okay. But they
But it-
can't take it. Nobody can come take it from us.
No.
Okay,
No.
Thank you.
Like I said, at most, we would be required to give it back.
okay,
But that's, usually you get a use it or give it back kind of warning.
okay. We don't want to give it back. We
Yeah.
want to use
No,
it.
no,
It-
I don't envision that ever happening.
And I-
Like I said, giving it back is actually more problem. It might be a little easier in something like this because it's probably very clear who it came from. But the problem with giving it back is they got the incentive, right?
Right,
Or, so
Right.
it just. you
Doesn't make
need to-
sense.
In my opinion, you have I'll call it fiduciary responsibility to provide a community benefit based off of that.
absolutely. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions?
I'm actually,
told-
if Walt, or, one of the things, we happen to have Nate in the room who's
Is that who that is there? I didn't know who it was, and I thought it was Nate, but I couldn't be sure.
I know that Sarah was talking about that we were gonna do a thing where we reevaluate how we do all the land. I assume that because land that has a conservation easement by definition isn't as valuable to a developer as land that can be developed. I assume that in other words, essentially by definition, it should be assessed at a lower rate. Is that correct? Or is there something prevents it? Okay.
Is everybody hearing him? Is his mic on?
No, I couldn't hear him.
Sorry, I didn't want, wasn't planning to speak.
I know he wasn't planning and I put him on the spot, but thank you for answering.
Okay.
So basically what he said is, anytime, since if you're doing it based off of the value of the land, the assessing based off the value of the land, then by definition, if you've taken uses away from it, you've decreased the value of that land, right? Now it depends on how restrictive those are. If all they can do is never build a gas station, right? But I can do any commercial thing, that's obviously not as big a thing as I can't do any structure, right? That's obviously a much bigger impact on the value of that land, so. I just wanted to make sure that, if we're talking about that I had that correct. I was pretty sure I had talked to Sarah about that in advance, but since Nate happened to be here, I put him on the spot to make sure we weren't doing something that ran contrary to assessment. Other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely. Could you tilt your mic up a little bit more? There we go.
I had a question about, and this is maybe getting way ahead of schedule, the, hang on. The reuse of buildings.
Yep.
Revitalization. It talks about encouraging reuse, redevelopment, and the revitalization of vacant, dormant, and especially dilapidated commercial buildings. Is there a gauge as to how long a property should be vacant or unused before it becomes dormant and dilapidated? Is that something that's too specific for this, or is that?
That was something we wanted to have a discussion on. I don't know that answer. My fear of a hard date is there might be some that fall into it. I didn't know if we ought to maybe just use what I'll call weasel words, that we essentially present a guideline, but that the board has the ability to shift the date one way or the other. I think we want to have something in there, or else everybody's going to argue, well, 6 months is a long time vacant, which obviously we don't think it is, but when I think of those properties, right, I'm going to use the really obvious ones, where things like the old Hostess building or the Halpin building, or Cartwrights, right? Those are all clearly long vacant and they'd all dilapidated, right? Now let's bring up No, what's it called? Gander Mountain.
Gander.
All right, Gander Mountain's been vacant for a while. Has it been, it's not dilapidated, but it's been vacant for a while, right? Is that, and maybe what we do is we basically have in their language, my thought is that the longer the property's been vacant or dilapidated, the greater the community or the greater the incentive could be. So my point is if somebody then says, well, this should apply, well, it's only been vacant for 2 years, so the community benefit's not going to be that big. But if it's been, vacant for, like, I don't know how long Cartwright's has been vacant, but it's a long time.
20.
That to me would be a much greater incentive that I'd be willing to offer somebody for Cartwright's.
Sometimes property is vacant by choice. There could be a performing lease on it. And if you have an out-of-town owner who continues to get rent for it, he doesn't care if it's vacant or not. Doesn't
Right.
matter. So you're not really, there's no reason to, from an owner's perspective, there's no reason to worry about whether it's occupied or not.
Yeah, and
Some properties historically are vacant for a long time. They're for sale, but perhaps the owner has an exaggerated opinion of the value of it. And as part of a portfolio, maybe it's just there and they anticipate waiting until they get some high offer.
And that's a perfect example of, as my understanding of what happened to the Hostess, that the people who owned it, one of them was from out of town and had an West Coast idea of property values. So I understand that. I guess I just look at, if we're going to try to steer developers to building into existing buildings versus breaking new ground, I guess I look at it this way. The residents don't care why it's empty. They just want to see it reused. And if that shakes that owner's purse strings loose, they're happy with it. I understand where you're coming from, and it feels a little wrong if they're doing it by choice, but again, either way, the open space is preserved because they're reusing an existing building. And the other thing that happens as those buildings aren't being used and start to fall into disrepair, my understanding is typically those folks come back and say, well, you need to lower my assessment because of the condition of the building.
It's been known to happen.
Yeah.
It's been known to happen.
And so, like I said, I just think I get it and it feels wrong somehow, but I also am the pragmatic sort, and either way the problem gets solved. That I guess looks into the other reason why I'm a little reluctant to put a hard date on it, because then it could be someone who, oh, I've got an opportunity, but if I wait 6 more months, I'm going to get a incentive, whereas I don't get one today. So instead they would get, maybe whatever that works out to be 2.5 years versus 3 years, right? So 1/6 less of an incentive, they might pull the trigger now instead of waiting. So maybe, board, I'd be curious, I'd like to get other board input on this as to how they feel. My thought is that maybe we put in there some language that the longer the building has been vacant, the greater the incentive, that it would be a minor incentive for it's something that's been vacant for a shorter period of time. What do other board members think?
So now if I'm the guy who went and bought a building that's been vacant for 4 or 5 years, and then this new law comes in and says they're going to give it a greater incentive for this, I'm feeling kind of left out. Because I think I should have been given an incentive for what I did. with
Are
the
you
building.
saying the ones that have already happened?
The ones that are happening, or, yeah, the ones that are happening.
Well, my point is, I guess my point is, if this law, once this law is in place, if you buy a building that's been empty for 4 years and you develop it, you are eligible for the incentive. Doesn't matter if it changes ownership.
Okay, so we're gonna grandfather in those that may have missed this while this rule was not in. That makes sense.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by grandfather in. The point is, if somebody didn't, building and it's already in, and I'll use the Hostess as an example, right? He's already built that in, he's put it in place. I'm not gonna go back, I don't see how we go back and give him something additional because he's already built it.
Okay,
Some of that's just, you know, any more than you're gonna go to a developer who built a neighborhood under one rule, and as the rules change, say, okay, now go ahead and build additional houses. Cram them into the places that you committed to having preserved space. I'm not sure what you mean by grandfathering, and, you know, and unfortunately, as I will also point out, rules change the other way. Just as if somebody builds to a particular standard and we tighten the standard and reduce the amount of density, we don't go back to guys who just finished building a neighborhood and say, rip 3 houses out.
no, I understand that, but it seems that your example gave an incentive to someone who had just bought a building and the law changed. So I guess we need to give it a lot more thought before we put any length of time on these buildings.
So I guess I'll point, Rob, ownership of the building doesn't matter in my opinion. I don't care who owns it. It's whether it's been occupied or used or not, right?
So if I own the building hasn't been occupied or used in 4 years, I can get that incentive by revitalizing the building?
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
Because again, the goal is to bring, you know, obviously the people who've been sitting on it for a long time must not have either the desire or the means to improve it. And so if it can, you know, again, we have a perfect example of this. We have somebody who's coming in, looking in for a warehouse. They expressed an interest in helping the community of their own, of saying, we'll use an existing dormant warehouse that hasn't been used, find us a building that fits this need, and we'll look at buying an existing one instead of building a new warehouse.
Yeah.
We were all
That
happy
makes
with that. We
perfect
gave
sense
them a
to
list
me.
of all the empty warehouse-like buildings that we were aware of, and they're pursuing that path.
Oh, that's great.
And so, you know, they happen to be one who don't need this incentive, but there are some who, when it gets down to, it's a not-for-profit who's doing it, so they don't care necessarily about maximizing the profits, but a lot of the land developments do. And so
Yes.
when they look at that equation and say, you know what? It would be $1 million to build a new one, and it'll be 1.2 million to revitalize this existing one, they're gonna go with the 1 million. Unless, you know, they could get, going back to the warehouse, well, we'll let you raise the ceiling higher, or we'll reduce your parking minimums, or we'll, you know, whatever else, you know, that there's certain things that improve their chances. Or, you know, the one that's the easiest to think about is, as people, you know, and especially with relations to the multi-family that we allowed in the mixed use overlay districts, right? We have a maximum unit density in those. Maybe if it were an existing building that's, you know, become an eyesore, we would allow their density to go higher than it otherwise would, because we really want to see that reused. And again, one of the things, you know, from a developer standpoint, that the greater the density, the more cost effective it is for them. Now,
Right.
the reason we typically don't want that huge high density is that does cause problems for our infrastructure.
Infrastructure, right.
But, you know, that's a trade that we as a town board would get to make that decision at the time. Is that a trade we're willing to make? Hey, you know, if I see, you know, pick an empty store, you know, a lot of people complain about Southtown and how empty it's been for so long, right? If we could see that revitalized and reused, all the better, you know, that would certainly be preferred to, as we see the amount of pushback that's going on to an apartment complex that's going in on empty land.
Right.
Right. Now, it's not exactly analogous because that land, the people who are coming in have owned that land for a long time. So it's not like somebody came in, wants to build an apartment, looked, found empty land, bought that. But that certainly is the case, right? We have certain apartment developers who are constantly looking for potential properties. We'd rather steer them to some of these tired retail areas. That was the whole point of the multi-use overlay district.
Right.
You know, and one of the things that's come up a bunch, and I know this has come up a couple of times with the former board, and I think it's come up with this board as well, is, you know, one of the things we hear is, boy, all they ever want to build are the high-end senior housing. I want to downsize but stay in Henrietta, but there's no place that's affordable, right?
Affordable, right.
So, you know, that's why we had that one in there. And a perfect example of that, again, is we've got a developer coming in to use the overlay district to put apartments in the parcel that used to be General Cinemas in the mall, so the southwest corner. You know, if they, as we talked to them about putting in affordable senior housing, right? The thing that they're going to look at is, well, I can make more money from the higher end housing, but if they can get a couple more units of affordable housing, then as they look at that equation, that could be the same. So if they could say, well, I can get, you know, and I'm just going to use round numbers, I can get 40 units of higher end housing and I can make this amount of money, or I can do 30 units of higher end plus 15 units of moderate housing for a total of 45. Well, I can make the same amount of money, and now we're serving the need for the community for affordable senior housing. So that's the idea of the incentive, even though the 45 units might be above the quote unquote legal limit for that particular zone.
Yep, that's understood.
Other questions? Okay, well, thanks, Walt. So, you know, one of the things in terms of on the process, as we talked about, we're gonna need to solidify a bit more of this. You'll see some of the law changes in terms of the incentive zoning, or excuse me, the open space incentive plan. So we updated that table. One of the things that I talked about, you know, right now, the way our code works, I can do the incentive zoning plan and then I can do a cluster subdivision and essentially do both. We want to change the code so that I can do neither. But the other thing that I wanted to have in there, because it's absolutely come up, especially when you look at senior housing, is a lot of seniors don't want big yards. They want a nice view. They don't want to have to maintain the yards. And so what we put in there is a procedure that essentially allows them to do what the cluster, the 278 clustering allows, whereas they do the conservation cluster and they lay out the lot following the rules of the conservation cluster. And then what they can do is after that's done, they can give us a drawing that says, I'm going to take half of the yards and I'm going to add them to the open space to the north. Now, I don't get additional benefit from that because it's calculated on the original compliant plan. So if they get to the 50% or 65%, it's whatever they get to. In this, from an incentive standpoint, that portion of the yard is still considered part of the yard requirements, not part of the open space requirements, but allows them to grow the open space so as to allow for lower lands. Again, the way that the most recent one, Forest View, did that is after they essentially did the conservation cluster, they then applied the regular clustering to shrink the lots below the minimum allowed in the district. The reason for those minimum lots is to prevent that dense neighborhood look, and especially ones front to back. So to be honest, in the forest view, it didn't happen, that the thing that we would want to prevent, but it could have. You know, as you have that minimum lot size, what it prevents is one row of housing right up against the back of the other one, right? It essentially enforces open space in between the houses. And so that's why we wanted to do it by this method, because that still enforces a space, but then allows them to, for lack of a better way to put it, cede part of their yards to the open space, so that if it's an HOA taking care of the open space, or if it's being granted, you know, donated to the town as the parkland, the parkland would increase, their yards would decrease, but the goals of the conservation cluster would have been met by that plan. So, you know, we're detailing how that is done, so that we get rid of this ambiguity that basically allows you to do both of them, because you can potentially end up with plans that run contrary to the goals of the conservation cluster. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Any other questions? You know, again, this is being done as a supplemental GEIS, so there will be a draft GEIS prepared. The town board will have a review process of that, much like we're doing now. And then what happens is we will call for public hearings. We'll present to the public the supplemental draft GEIS. We'll get their feedback. We'll use that, answer all the questions, create the final GEIS, and then we'll complete the seeker process, and then we'll adopt the local laws, assuming that each of those happen. So it's, again, the same process that we went through with the comprehensive land use plan update. These supplemental will essentially be added to those. So the GEIS will be added to the one from the comprehensive land use plan. It'll essentially be an addendum to it when anyone goes to pull it down. And, you know, again, we're finishing up the work that a lot of this came out of those hours and hours of meetings 2 years ago. We just didn't have the time to get. Incentive zoning was one of the things that we decided not to rush, because if you get it wrong, you can cause all kinds of problems. So that's where we're at.
Well, I'm glad we're addressing it now.
Okay?
Thanks, Walt.
No,
Thank you,
no
Walt.
problem. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
By the way, one of the things that we never did is, since this is technically a town meeting, should we have taken roll? I don't know if one of our town clerks is still on.
We do not have a town clerk on.
Okay, well, Craig, I designate you as the person to take roll.
Okay, roger that, sir. Thank you very much. So we'll do a quick roll call. I don't know the order. So
Doesn't matter.
Barley,
Councilmember Barley,
Here.
Councilmember Stafford,
Here.
Councilmember Safranek,
Here.
Councilmember Bolzner,
Here.
Supervisor Schultz.
here. Okay, and then, since we're pretty much done, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Seconded.
Okay, hearing no objections, meeting adjourned. Thanks again.
Bye,
Walt.
everybody.
Thanks for everybody who showed up.
Thanks, everybody.
again, Walt.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
Yeah.
Thank you. Careful, Becky might hurt you.